Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
El Clasico, pre-season though it is still a Clasico, and in this encounter we got a closer look at how Xavi is plotting for his second season surge, as well as Ancelotti's new all-star midfield. In the end, the match ended in a flattering 3-0 win for Barcelona, but let's examine the tactics we saw from both managers, beginning with Barcelona in possession. And what was actually interesting was the amount of overlap between Real Madrid and Barcelona's systems, with completely different end results on the pitch. From the goal kick, Real Madrid could be quite efficient in the press, with the dual forwards of Vinicius and Rodrigo looking to press high up, whilst Bellingham was the most advanced attacking midfielder, usually sitting on the deepest pivot, be it Romeu or De Jong. With the deeper midfield occupied, often Barcelona would look to shift to a double pivot of Romeu and De Jong, but in situations such as this, Valverde was often keen to join in order to make that central progression much more difficult. From the goal kicks, Carvajal from right back was much more aggressive than usual in the press, whilst Camavinga would often occupy this position, half ready to press Araujo, but also looking to solidify the midfield as much as he could. However, in open play and some goal kick situations, we saw a lot of automatisms from Barcelona in this first phase of build-up, as Christensen and Koundé would often split either side of Ter Stegen so that he was the third man. With the front two pressing, these scenarios were much more difficult, as they would often draw in one forward who would be looking to cut off the lateral pass into Koundé, for example, whilst the other would then sit on the remaining centre-back. However, Ter Stegen is brave on the ball, as was De Jong, who was often the outlet, receiving even when under heavy pressure, and this would then open up the wall pass into Koundé, who now suddenly had space to seek men higher up the pitch, whilst the front two of Real Madrid had somewhat been taken out of the game. In this first phase of play, Barcelona could at times stick to somewhat of a more traditional back four. However, what we saw with Barcelona is that they rarely lined up with a midfield three, but rather it was a box midfield with a double pivot of De Jong and Romeu, whilst Pedri wasn't even a winger and would come in off the left-hand side, with Gundogan moving into this left-hand space. Initially, this doesn't look too bad for Real Madrid, as they could easily shift to a man-to-man situation in the midfield, with Tchouaméni and Camavinga covering the men higher up and Valverde and Bellingham being more aggressive, although the Barcelona midfield was fluid in general. And this back four of Barcelona's could shift extremely quickly, as we would see Balde push high up on the left-hand side in order to tie up Carvajal, whilst Dembele on the right remained wide, tying up Mendy, making it almost impossible for him to look and press a fullback. So what would often happen in these situations, by Araujo not immediately tucking in, he would be free to receive in these scenarios, and with Mendy tied up, it was often up to Camavinga to spring from midfield to look to press his man, which led to several problems for Real Madrid. With Camavinga dragged away from the midfield, Pedri, rather than staying central, would often come into these scenarios, so that technically there was a 2 versus 1 against Camavinga through Araujo and Pedri. And if Pedri did receive in these scenarios, now there was a 2 versus 1 against Ferland Mendy. So essentially, Real Madrid pressing with the front two and having both of their fullbacks pinned deep left them looking extremely vulnerable down the flanks. And although Barcelona could operate with similar system down both flanks, potentially with Balde receiving the first outpass from Ter Stegen and dragging Tchouaméni or Valverde, for the most part this was not Barcelona's preferred play, as they would rather have Araujo deeper and Balde higher up the pitch. So what we saw is that Barcelona tended to play down the right-hand side. So with Camavinga having been dragged out and Pedri beginning to move wide in support, what we would often see is the Real Madrid midfield being dragged across the pitch as they look to compensate for such situations. This would also naturally have an effect on the backline, who would also tuck in, and Gundogan could drift across in order to make this overload much worse, but he tended to stay higher up the pitch, potentially drawing Carvajal or Militao. And what this would open up was the potential for a direct switch into Balde, or Barcelona could play it through the midfield, but the end result would be the same, with the young fullback then having the space to drive up the flank. getting into dangerous zones. And when Barcelona were higher up the pitch, their back three became much more explicit, with Araujo fully tucking in so that Barcelona had a formation that could vary slightly between a 3-2-5 if Gundogan and Pedri pushed right up the pitch, but for the most part, they were dedicated in the midfield, looking to keep possession and draw Real Madrid in much more centrally, once again to open up those flanks. Lewandowski would also look to drop in at times into the midfield, potentially drawing a centre-back and creating space for the likes of Dembele, or even midfield runners to look to go beyond him. And Barcelona were fairly effective in this match. But despite the heavy loss Real Madrid were promising, whilst Barcelona were also more effective when defending against a similar shape as Real Madrid did. Particularly early on, Barcelona were looking to press high up the pitch, and this often forced Real Madrid long to the diminutive duo of Rodrigo and Vinicius, and despite them not being the tallest, they were at times looking dangerous, looking to feed off of each other. But of course, the centre-backs had the physical advantage. But what exactly made this Barcelona press so effective? Well, much like Barcelona, Real Madrid had a midfield four, and in fact that four was much more explicit on the team sheet, and would often see Tchouaméni and Camavinga being slightly deeper, and Valverde and Bellingham being higher, although Real Madrid were much more prone to having a genuine diamond. And once again, despite having a midfield three on paper, Barcelona actually had a midfield four, as Pedri would come infield, and he and Gundogan would defend on the deeper pivots of Tchouaméni and Camavinga, whilst De Jong and Romeu picked up the men deeper. And Real Madrid, when they were defending, had a genuine back four, which left their flanks looking more vulnerable. But Xavi adapted his shape so that in fact they had a back three, with Araujo tucking in, and Balde could then push higher up down the left-hand side, whilst Dembele was actually slightly deeper. So their defensive shape often looked like a 3-4-3, with Pedri and Gundogan being in closest proximity to Lewandowski. So what we now see here is that the midfield is man-to-man, and the wide areas can be much more easily covered by the wing-backs. And Barcelona also have a man spare against the front two of Real Madrid, meaning that the easiest spare man for Real Madrid were the centre-backs, who may pose much less danger. But that does not mean that this shape was infallible from Barcelona. And in fact, Dembele of course is not a natural wing-back, so Mendy could make untracked runs when Dembele fell asleep, meaning Real Madrid could still look to penetrate with these long balls over the top. But the runs in beyond were a big play for Real Madrid, so with Mendy being much more aggressive than Carvajal when looking to attack, along with Vinicius often drifting deep, what we would often see is this back three of Barcelona being dragged across, and this would present the opportunity for Bellingham to make runs on the outside of the widest centre-back. Or if the ball was being played through the midfield, he could be played in along the ground to potentially get in on goal. However, the work rate of De Jong in this match was commendable, and every time there was a runner in behind, he seemed to be the man who had spotted the danger and would follow his man much deeper. But with the Real Madrid midfield being picked up man-to-man and somewhat finding it tough to play through, we saw the maturity of the Real Madrid front two, who showed good game intelligence, as Rodrigo could drop in to be the fifth man and look to receive much more penetrating passes, and it will be a difficult decision for the Barcelona centre-backs to follow deep, purely because of the pace and movement of Vinicius potentially getting into a much more dangerous situation. But beyond that, the forwards had excellent movement and would not stay central if it was not advantageous, and often, situationally, we would see them drop deeper to look to create potential 2 versus 1s past the wing-backs if they were caught higher up the pitch, and this could lead to temporary 2 versus 1 situations, or 1v1s, and in the second half in particular, Vinicius had great success against Dest. However, Barcelona could also shift across in these scenarios, particularly if Real Madrid were attacking down the left-hand side, purely because the threat of Carvajal down the right-hand side is a much less intimidating prospect, so they would be happy to potentially allow this switch to the fullback. This match was only friendly on paper, and if the rest of the season's Clásicos are anything like this, we're in for a treat, as Xavi showed great adaptation in this match. But despite doing so, Real Madrid was still a massive threat, hitting the woodwork for fun. But drop your thoughts on this match below. And if you did enjoy this, you'll love this video, where we looked into the tactical tale of Messi's most iconic moment.